There was no rule book, no printed list pinned to the wall, no formal announcement at the breakfast table, and yet every child who grew up in a British home in the 1970s knew exactly where the lines were. You didn't cross them, you didn't question them, you simply lived inside them, the way you lived inside the walls of the house itself. This is about those rules, 25 of them, real ones, the kind that shaped how you moved through a room, how you answered a telephone, how you sat at a table, how you spoke or didn't speak when adults were present. Some of them will make you smile, some of them will make you wince, and at least one of them, I suspect, will hit a little closer to home than you're expecting. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about growing up in Britain in the 1970s. The rules weren't cruel. They weren't random. They were a language. A compressed, unspoken language for love, discipline, pride, and survival, spoken by a generation that had lived through rationing, through war, through cold that got inside the bones and stayed there. They didn't always say what they felt, but they told you in 100 small ways exactly where you stood. So let's go back to the coal fire in the front room, back to the sound of the 6 o'clock news, back to the smell of Sunday roast and the particular silence that fell when Dad walked through the door, back to a Britain that moved slower, colder, and somehow with more weight than the one we live in today. Rule number 1. And this one was sacred. The front room was not for living in. Every house had one. It went by different names depending on where you grew up. The front room, the best room, the parlor, the sitting room. And in the vast majority of British working-class and middle-class homes in the 1970s, that room sat perfectly preserved behind a closed door, used for approximately 3 occasions per year. Christmas, a death in the family, or a visit from someone important enough to justify the best china. The carpet in that room was protected. The cushions on the sofa were arranged and untouched. There was a cabinet with ornaments that nobody touched, a clock that ticked on the mantelpiece, and curtains that stayed half-drawn even in summer. The family didn't sit in there. The children absolutely did not play in there. It existed for appearances, and in a decade when appearances mattered enormously, that was reason enough. You knew this rule without being told, and if you forgot it, even once, you were reminded in terms that left no room for doubt. But the front room was just the beginning. Because behind every door in that house, including the back door, which brings us to rule number 2, there was an order to things, a protocol, and it started with who used which entrance. The back door was for family. The front door was for guests. This wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. If you grew up in a terraced house or a semi-detached in the 1970s, you already know exactly what this means. Friends came round the back. Neighbors came round the back. The milkman left things at the front, but even he knew his place. The front door was reserved for formality, for the insurance man, for the vicar, for relatives you saw twice a year and had to impress. It was a class distinction disguised as architecture, and it ran deep. Speaking of the milkman, rule number 3, and this one affected the entire rhythm of the household. In 1970, 94% of British homes had their milk delivered to the doorstep by an electric float. 94%. The milkman wasn't a novelty, he was infrastructure. He was the first sound of the morning before the alarm clock, before the kettle, before the radio. Glass bottles on stone steps, gold top, silver top, occasionally a note tucked underneath requesting an extra pint. And the note for the milkman was sacred. You didn't forget it. You didn't leave it too late. Changing your order was a weekly ritual conducted with the seriousness of a financial transaction. That small folded piece of paper, left out the night before, was as binding as a signed contract. There were rules around food that went far deeper than the milkman, though. Rule number 4 arrived at the dinner table, and it did not negotiate. You finished what was on your plate. This wasn't simply a preference. It was moral law. The generation of parents raising children in the 1970s had grown up in the shadow of rationing, real rationing, the kind where butter, meat, sugar, and tea were measured and allocated by the government. Rationing in Britain didn't fully end until 1954. Sugar went first in 1953. Meat held on until the following year. The women who stood at those cookers in the 70s had spent their own childhoods being told that waste was sin, and they passed that lesson on with absolute conviction. If you didn't finish your dinner, it went in the fridge, covered in foil, and it reappeared the next morning. Cold peas for breakfast was not a punishment. It was a lesson. And the lesson was this: food is not entertainment. Food is not optional. You eat what you're given, and you are grateful for it. Rule number 5 sat at the same table but had nothing to do with food. Nobody ate until the head of the household was seated. In the 1970s, that almost always meant father. He came home, he sat down, and then and only then did the meal begin. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't resented out loud. It was simply the order of things, as natural and unquestioned as the fact that his chair, rule number 6, belonged exclusively to him, Dad's chair. Every house had one. A specific armchair, positioned at a specific angle to the television, worn into shape by one person and one person only. Children didn't sit in it. Guests didn't sit in it. If every other seat in the room was taken, you stood. You perched on an arm. You sat on the floor. The chair was not available. It was his, in the same way the house was his. Quietly, completely, and without discussion. These weren't small habits. They were the architecture of authority inside the home. And the 1970s British household ran on that authority the way the street outside ran on gas. But there was another kind of authority, one that didn't belong to any person in the house. It came through a box in the corner of the room, and it had its own set of rules entirely. Rule number 7. When the news was on, the house went silent. Not quieter, silent. In the 1970s, British households had access to 3 television channels. That was the world. There was no scrolling, no choosing, no algorithm deciding what you might enjoy. There was a schedule, printed in the Radio Times or the TV Times, and that schedule was the law of the evening. You planned around it. You looked forward to things, you waited for them. And when the news came on, the 6 o'clock, the 9 o'clock, you did not speak. You did not ask questions. You did not wander across the room in front of the screen. The newsreader was delivering information that mattered. The unspoken understanding was that attention was owed. Children who forgot this were dealt with by a look. One look. That was usually sufficient. Rule number 8 was connected to the television but extended beyond it. The Radio Times and the TV Times were treated as household documents. Plans were made around the schedule. If something important was on Thursday evening's arrangements accommodated it. There was no catching up later. There was no recording it. If you missed it, you missed it, and that was a genuine loss that could last a week. Rule number 9 moved away from the sitting room and into the hallway, where the telephone lived. You answered it correctly, or you didn't answer it at all. The telephone in a 1970s British home sat on a small table in the hallway, often on a purpose-built telephone seat. It rang, and if you answered it, you announced the number. Not hello, the number, 7421. Clear, precise, formal. Because the person calling had no way of knowing whether they'd reached the right household. And the correct thing to do was confirm it immediately. Calling after 9 in the evening was considered deeply inappropriate unless there was an emergency. The telephone after 9 meant trouble. It meant a hospital. It meant something had happened. A social call after that hour was a breach of etiquette so significant it would be talked about. Rule number 10. Lights off when you leave the room. This one was enforced with a passion. You could be gone for 30 seconds. You could be coming straight back. It didn't matter. The light went off. Electricity cost money, and money was not something to be scattered carelessly across empty rooms. The parent who discovered a lit and unoccupied room was a parent who delivered a lecture that you remembered for days. Which leads directly to rule number 11. Never stand with the fridge door open. Know what you want before you open it. Make your decision. Open the door, retrieve the item, close the door. The cold escaping was waste. The electricity powering it was waste. Standing there was behavior that prompted the phrase, "This is not a restaurant." Rule number 12 is one that younger generations genuinely struggle to understand. There was no heating upstairs, not rationed, not limited, simply absent. In a very large number of British homes throughout the 1970s, central heating existed, but it was far from universal, particularly in older terraced houses and council properties. The stairs were a threshold. Below them, warmth. Above them, the cold. Bedrooms in winter meant ice on the inside of the windows. It meant undressing downstairs in the warm and running upstairs in your nightclothes. It meant a hot water bottle placed in the bed an hour before sleep. A ritual performed by mothers across the country with quiet dedication. Warmth was something you prepared for, not something you assumed. And that hot water bottle placed without a word, waiting for you at the end of a cold day, was for many children the most tangible expression of love they ever received. But love in the 1970s British household was rarely spoken. It was demonstrated. And the way it was demonstrated brings us to the rules that nobody ever named out loud, the ones that governed who you were allowed to be. Rule number 13. Children are seen and not heard. This wasn't a saying people quoted ironically. It was operating policy. When adults were in the room, when company arrived, children were expected to greet politely and otherwise become invisible. You sat quietly. You didn't interrupt. You didn't offer opinions on adult conversations. You didn't demand attention. This rule shaped something profound. A generation that learned to read the room before speaking, that learned patience as a reflex, that understood that not every thought needed to be voiced. Rule number 14, you did not talk back. If a parent corrected you, you accepted it. If a teacher reprimanded you, you took it. Compliance, not debate. This was called cheek, and cheek had consequences. Physical punishment in British schools was still legal throughout the 1970s. The cane was standard. It wasn't abolished until 1986. At home, the belt or the slipper was not unusual. This is the truth of that decade. Pretending otherwise would be a disservice. Rule number 15. Sunday was not an ordinary day. It had its own atmosphere. Sunday meant church for many families, as a fixed point in the week. It meant your good clothes. It meant behavior that matched the occasion. Then came the Sunday roast. The Sunday roast was the axis around which the entire day rotated. The smell built through the afternoon. Sitting down to it was a ceremony. The table was set properly. Everyone sat together. You did not reach across the table. You did not complain. After Sunday dinner, the afternoon settled into a particular stillness. Shops were closed, all of them by law. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do. The pace dropped completely. Adults dozed. The television offered limited consolation, a quality to that mandatory rest. Rule number 16. The best china was not for daily use. Every home had it. A full set kept behind glass. The cups were thin and elegant, and none of it was used on a Tuesday. It appeared for significant occasions, a visiting relative, a special anniversary. The daily cups were thick and chipped and comfortable. The best china was aspirational. It was the household's way of saying, we are people who have standards. We know the difference between ordinary days and important ones, observed in the places that governed the day. Rule number 17. Bath night was not every night. In a significant number of British homes, particularly in older properties, the bath was a weekly event. Sunday night was traditional. The water was heated by a back boiler behind the coal fire. Hot water was finite, meaning the family bathed in sequence, oldest to youngest or youngest to oldest. This wasn't poverty, it was practicality. You didn't waste hot water on whim. You bathed when it was time. The rest of the week you managed with a flannel. Rule number 18. You kept the doors between rooms closed. Partly this was about heat, keeping warmth in the rooms that had it and not losing it to the hallway or the stairs, but it was also about privacy and containment. The kitchen was the kitchen. The sitting room was the sitting room. You didn't drift between spaces with the doors hanging open. The house was divided into territories, and you respected the divisions. Rule number 19. You did not make a fuss. Pain was managed quietly. Disappointment was absorbed internally. Illness, unless genuinely serious, was not a reason to stop. You got on with it. You didn't complain about the cold, or the discomfort, or the boredom, or the fact that the dinner wasn't what you'd hoped for. The phrase was universal. Get on with it. Or its close relative, it'll do. Or the most British of all, mustn't grumble. Before we reach the final 5 rules. And the last one is the most quietly powerful of all. This feels like the right moment to say something directly to you. If you've been watching this channel and these stories feel like yours, if this is the Britain you remember, the houses you grew up in, the rules you lived by, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week there's something new here about the Britain that shaped us. The food, the streets, the music, the moments that don't make the history books but live in us permanently. Leave a comment below telling us which of these rules you remember most clearly. Like this video if it's brought something back, and if someone you know would recognize every single one of these rules, share it with them, because some things are better remembered together. Rule number 20, you never discussed money. Not at the table, not in front of the children, not in front of guests. What things cost, what the family earned, what the mortgage was, whether there were difficulties, none of this was spoken about openly. Money was private in a way that almost nothing is private today. The neighbors didn't know your business. The relatives didn't know your business. And the children absolutely did not know your business. Rule number 21. Women managed the home. And that was considered a complete occupation. In the early 1970s, the vast majority of married British women did not have their own bank account. This is not an exaggeration, and it is not a figure of speech. Until the Sex Discrimination Act and the Equal Pay Act of 1975, the legal and financial landscape for British women was fundamentally different from today. A woman seeking credit, a mortgage, or even her own account often required a male guarantor, a husband, a father, a male relative willing to vouch for her financial credibility. Inside the home, the husband worked. The wife managed. The shopping, the cooking, the cleaning, the children's clothing, the school appointments, the household budget. All of it coordinated and executed, usually without acknowledgement and almost never with thanks. It was simply expected, which meant it was largely invisible. Many women of that generation were extraordinarily capable, running complex domestic operations on tight budgets, with no help and no recognition. And many of them did it, not because they had chosen to, but because the world had not yet made the alternative readily available. Rule number 22. You dressed appropriately for the occasion. Visiting relatives required a certain standard. Going into town required a certain standard. Church required your absolute best. There was a clear and widely understood hierarchy of dress, and appearing at an occasion underdressed was a form of disrespect to the host, to the occasion, to the family name. A mother sending her child out of the house in something that didn't meet the standard of the destination would feel the shame of it personally, and she would not allow it. Rule number 23. You did not air your grievances publicly. Whatever happened inside the house stayed inside the house. Arguments between parents, financial difficulties, tensions with relatives, disappointments of any kind, these were private. The phrase, "we don't wash our dirty linen in public," was not a metaphor people discussed. It was a governing principle applied without question. The face you showed the street was composed and respectable. What happened behind the door was entirely separate. Rule number 24. You respected the neighbor's peace. Noise carried in terraced streets, gardens backed onto gardens, walls were not thick. The understanding that your behavior affected the people around you, that the volume of your radio, the time you closed the gate, the hour your guests departed, these things mattered. Being a bad neighbor was a genuine social failure. Being a good one was a quiet form of pride. And rule number 25, the last one. The one that wasn't spoken because it didn't need to be. You didn't say it, you showed it. Love, in the 1970s British household, was almost never stated directly between parents and children. It wasn't the culture, it wasn't the language. The fathers of that generation had been raised by men who had survived 2 world wars. The mothers had been shaped by shortage and endurance. Sentiment, expressed openly, felt dangerously close to weakness. But there was the hot water bottle placed in your bed before you got there. There was the school uniform washed and ironed without being asked. There was the extra potato put on your plate without comment. There was the coat brought out to you when you forgot yours, handed over gruffly. No eye contact, no words. There was your father sitting in the car for 10 minutes after getting home, gathering himself before coming in, because whatever the day had cost him, he was going to walk through that door and hold it together for the people inside. That was the rule behind all the rules. Not a word of it written down, not a word of it spoken. But every single person who grew up in a British home in the 1970s felt it. Every day. These 25 rules weren't a cage. They were the structure of something. Of a kind of life that was harder and quieter and more disciplined than the one we live now. A life where you learn to read the room, to endure the cold, to find comfort in routine, to say everything important without saying a word. Tell us in the comments which of these rules lived in your house. Which one are you still following without thinking? And which one, looking back, was actually a form of love you didn't recognize at the time? We'll be here next week with more. Until then, take care of yourself. And if you can, call someone who remembers. This was British Nostalgia.